Okay, so it is 9:30, or sorry, 7:30 Calgary time. Oh, yes, I will do that. Okay. It is now 7:30, so I think we'll get started on our bird study group for tonight. So I'd like to start with reading the Nature Calgary Land Acknowledgement. In the spirit of reconciliation with our Indigenous neighbors, Nature Calgary wishes to recognize that we have the privilege to carry out our activities within the traditional territory of the Treaty 7 First Nations. We thank the peoples of Treaty 7 and the Métis Region 3 for their past and ongoing stewardship of the natural heritage of Southern Alberta. Is John McFall on? I just been trying to scan the names, but I don't see John. Are you there, John? I guess not. So I'm just going to go right ahead then and introduce our speaker for tonight is Scott Lovell, Dr. Scott Lovell from St. Mary's University in Calgary. And Scott has done a lot of his research on flycatchers in our area. And so if you're like me, every flycatcher you see, I just call it a least because I have no idea which one of the four it is. And hopefully after tonight, we'll be able to distinguish between the different flycatchers that are around in Alberta. So Scott, I am going to share my screen. There we go. So you Perfect. Should be able to bring up your slides. And if everybody just stay muted, write your questions in the chat box and we'll do questions after, if that's okay with everybody. Okay.
Wait just 1 second here. Okay, recording on, sharing screen. Can you all see my screen? Hello?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Okay, I just want to make sure. Thank you very much. Good evening. Thank you again for inviting me to come in. And I want to thank Nature Calgary Bird Study Group for inviting me. And I just looked for the 5th or 6th time. I think I missed one of my talks. So I really appreciate this opportunity to kind of talk shop with you all about birds. So I really appreciate the opportunity. And it's always great to see you all. Although we're not in person, it's nice to see all your names and your little pictures. This is a talk I actually gave before with Calgary Naturalist, or Nature Calgary in 2013. When I just had finished my master's with the flycatchers themselves. I've updated this talk a little bit and I'm going to go into a little more detail. When Anne asked me to do the talk, I really didn't have any research because of the pandemic. I hadn't really done anything. And she suggested, with the pandemic, there's so many new birders, why don't you revisit this talk? And it was a great opportunity to talk about one of my favorite groups of birds. Not many people can say that, I know, but today night we're going to talk about the Empidonax flycatchers. And I titled this talk, it's one of those little green birds making sense in identifying the gnat masters, the Empidonax flycatchers. Empidonax is the genus of the flycatchers we're talking about, and that means king of the gnats. And I really like that. I think that's a really neat term. And this picture I have here on my cover slide here from Peterson's 1941 field guide, I think really sums up the Empidonax in a really good way. So it's got just a picture of a Western flycatcher there, and he simply says 5 other flycatchers are very similar to the species and just names it. So even in 1941, Peterson knew that the flycatchers, particularly the Empidonax, were kind of a menace to birders and a real challenge to birders to actually identify it to species. And hopefully tonight, we're going to go through the Empidonax we have here in Alberta, and hopefully you get some insight on actually how to help identify those birds. I started thinking about this talk and thinking about, okay, what are some difficult birds to identify bird-wise, group-wise? What are some easy groups? Of course, I Googled it, And Birders World had come up with kind of for every bird in North America, for the families, what's an easy group, what's a hard group, what's a tricky group, and so forth on a scale of 1 to 5. So I thought I'd kind of start by kind of talking about that. They list easy groups as things like ibis, things like pelicans, so effectively large birds that, you know, are fairly stationary and you can, you know, spend some time IDing. Oops, sorry. So I'm not going to go through all 5 here. There's a trickier group, number 4. This is mainly the sparrows. Sparrows are always notoriously difficult. And warblers, I think they're talking about the confusing fall warblers, that picture at the bottom, as they didn't really say this, said warblers. And those are tricky, but again, if you get the field marks down, it's quite straightforward to do. Then we get to the hardest group here. Sorry, there's a delay here in my screen. The hardest group, they list 3 big groups of birds. They list the Empidonax flycatchers, they list the gulls, they list the shorebirds. I have to agree with them. I find gulls and shorebirds extremely difficult to identify. I don't know if I don't have the patience for it or so forth. It just takes a lot of energy for me to identify those birds. Needless to say, though, I have huge amounts of patience with the Empidonax flycatchers, that one in the upper right, left corner. And so that's really going to be the focus of the talk tonight, trying to identify this really tough group of birds. I'm going to talk, first of all, about my early exposure to Empidonax, because this kind of tells the story of kind of how I've learned that this is a lot harder group to identify than I originally recognized. So I grew up in the southeastern United States in Tennessee. And for the most part, most of the Empidonax we get in the east, particularly in the southeast, are spring migrants, which is fantastic if you're birding, because during spring migration, these flycatchers are singing, they're calling, they're being fairly conspicuous, as conspicuous as a green bird can be, but they're calling and singing. So quite easy to at least begin to learn and again to identify them. I apologize for the picture of the cardinal there. This is the only non-Empidonax picture I think in my talk. I just figured a cardinal really represents eastern birds. So that's kind of what I was setting up for here. So yeah, so southeastern birds, most of these migrants are spring migrants. I had one summer resident in these deciduous forests where I grew up. That was the Acadian flycatcher. So I got used to that pizza vocalization. It just says pizza, pizza, pizza all the time. And so just with that, and with these spring migrants calling and singing, my thoughts were, wow, this is a breeze. Why do so many people have such trouble with Empidonax flycatchers? Because they're singing, they're calling, they're conspicuous. I didn't get it at first. However, things changed when I moved to Alberta. So I moved up to Calgary in 2000 to start my master's program. So kind of talking about these Empidonax trial by fire about 2000, 2003. For my master's, I was going to work on alder flycatchers. And so I did research on alder flycatchers, very little information on the group itself, focusing mainly on their song and vocalizations. When I got to Calgary, my supervisor took me out to what was going to be my field site, Bryant Creek. Here's a picture of Bryant Creek here on the left. This is on Highway 68 in Kananaskis. And I thought, okay, this is going to be great. We're going to step out of the car. I'm going to hear alders all the time, all over the place in these willow trees. I'll know exactly what they are. This will be fantastic. I'm spending the next 2 years with this. Awesome. However, once we got out of the car, things kind of changed because we didn't encounter just one Empidonax flycatcher. We encountered in about half an hour at Bryant Creek, at least 4 or 5 different Empidonax flycatchers in the area. That made me kind of rethink the situation. You know, this idea that, oh, it's gonna be so easy to identify and so forth. I started thinking to myself, I'm gonna be spending the next 2 years identifying these flycatchers. I have to be able to identify an alder flycatcher. It kind of spurred me on to learn about Empidonax. And it also, my youthful confidence in identifying these birds kind of faded, and my hubris with identifying them kind of faded as well, unfortunately. But not all is lost. So I've mentioned the term Empidonax flycatcher several times. I've shown you a grainy black and white picture from Peterson's guide, but I really haven't defined what an Empidonax flycatcher is. Empidonax flycatchers are simply small songbirds with olive upper parts, pale throats and bellies, whitish wing bars, and at times an eye ring, and that eye ring really varies. So you can sum this up as they are very drab. I would even say dull, and I do like these birds, but I'd say dull in plumage overall. And again, very few features on their plumage to help you identify the species themselves. All are extremely similar in plumage. So therefore, you can't just simply use plumage to identify this. You need other field marks to actually get to species themselves. That's going to be the focus of this talk. In all, there are 15 species of Empidonax flycatchers recognized. Here in Alberta, we have 7 or 8 species. And I say or because I'm going to talk about this in a bit. There's some kind of conversation about 1 or 2 of these species that we have in the province. More work's going to need to be done on that. That's kind of where we are, though. So out of the 15 species, Alberta has a nice healthy population. And all of these birds in Alberta come up here to breed. They come up here kind of in mid-May, stay till about August, and then migrate south to Central America. Some of them go all the way to South America. So very long migration for these birds. What we're seeing here is a phylogeny of Empidonax. So this is a tree of relationships within the Empidonax flycatchers themselves. This is done after a paper in 2002 by Johnson and Cicero. And this is using DNA to find out relationships among the birds. And when you kind of look at this, the double asterisk indicates species we have here in the province. You'll notice there are kind of 3 or 4 different colored groups here. I'm going to talk about those in just a minute. So when we look at these phylogeny, this is just relationships among the Empidonax flycatchers. This is done with DNA. When we do this, we typically anchor the tree with the closest living relative or group of birds. Here it's the peewees, genus Cantopus. So it's peewees and birds like that. When you look at the color here, we have 3 major groups, and each of these groups just kind of represents individuals or species that are closely related to one another. So the yellow line is Acadian flycatcher. It has no living relatives. It's kind of on an island unto itself. And then you move up, you have the purple group and takes up Pacific slope flycatcher, cordilleran, yellowish flycatcher, yellow-bellied flycatcher. And then in the blue group, you've got white-throated, alder, willow. And then the red group seems to be the most speciose kind of group of flycatchers. These are separated really by habitat, where I think of the red group as being kind of forest, either deciduous or montane or coniferous forest, where the blue group there, the alders and willows are essentially in wet types of habitat. The purple group kind of is montane, wet, soggy habitat, where the Acadian flycatcher is just deciduous forest itself. And the problem with Empidonax, you can kind of see based on these pictures I have here from the National Geographic Guide themselves, they're extremely similar in plumage. They're all green, they all have a tinge of yellow, they're all about the same size, they have wing bars. Plumage is not going to help differentiate these species. People have been desperate to kind of find out field marks about these flycatchers themselves, and lots have been suggested. However, few are 100%. I mean, very few things are 100% in the world, but here with these identification marks, very few can identify 100% of the birds exactly to the correct species. Or some of these suggested field marks have been really hard to see. If you have to kind of look at the bird from underneath and turn your head, and it's got to turn its head a certain angle, you're not going to be able to see that field mark. It's going to be fairly useless. And a lot of these have actually been applied to birds in your hand themselves. So people that are banding, a lot of keys are there to actually figure out what type of Empidonax you actually have. But if we're in the field itself and we're looking at these through binoculars, that's really not going to help us at all. And so, you know, that's kind of the issue here. How do we figure out what type of flycatcher do we actually have? I'm going to tell you the incorrect approach to identifying flycatchers, then I'll tell you the correct approach. The incorrect approach is simply trying to identify a non-singing bird on migration. When these birds are not singing, they're all going to look very similar. A lot of these are moving through this area at the same time. And so you're not likely to be able to identify it correctly at all by trying to identify a non-singing bird on migration. The correct strategy.
Sorry, Mark, are we supposed Yeah, we're not seeing new slides. We're still on the,
Okay.
Tell him to go back to what he did the first step there.
What should I do?
well, now we've got a new problem, slide up called the problem.
Okay. Why don't I do this? Okay. If I do that, do you see the tree?
We saw that, and now we've got the tree.
Now you see the problem.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. That's where I am. We're going to do it this way.
Oh, well, that's fine.
So
Okay,
bear with
that's
me
good.
here. And again, I apologize for technical issues here.
There,
So the
that's
problem,
perfect.
again, these birds are super similar. And so we're going to go over tonight, hopefully if this continues to work right, how to actually correctly identify these birds. And it does take time, it does take patience. And if we do that, we're pretty good. So the keys to an Empidonax identification, while all species look alike in terms of plumage themselves, you can use other characteristics to really narrow down the field and figure out, at least from those 15 or 7 or 8 Empidonax we have here in Alberta, which ones would we actually have. This may or may not lead to species identification. You can at least get kind of one of those groups. Oh, it's a Willow and Alder. Oh, it's a Dusky or Hammond's. At least you can get fairly close. Characteristics we can use aside from plumage to do this is the shape of the bill. So is the bill kind of wide and flat here, kind of on the left of this picture? Or is it kind of narrow and skinny here on the right? The mandible color, so the lower bill color does differ between these species. Habitat plays a major role. That's, I would say, one of the key terms here to figure out what Empidonax you have is the habitat. Its behavior. Does it sing very conspicuously from a perch? Does it kind of wag its tail? Does it flick its wings? Does it flick its tail? Kind of what is the behavior of the bird itself? The shape of the wingtip really is for birds in the hand, but some of these pictures I'm going to show you later on, you'll see some of these birds have very short wings comparative to their body themselves, and that's a nice field mark as well. But by far the most important clue in being able to identify these birds is vocalizations. Being able to identify vocalizations, whether it be song or call note, is by far the most, the best way to really figure out what Empidonax you have. So we're going to take some time tonight and go through the Empidonax we have here in Alberta using not plumage, but these other characteristics about these birds. So now we're seeing least flycatcher. Slide.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. It's nice to know I'm talking to someone. Thank you. So least flycatcher, by far the most common flycatcher we have in the province here. Just kind of looking at the overall shape of the bird. So kind of take a look at the picture as I kind of describe it. It's a fairly small bird with a rounded head. It's got a very short beak that's wide. So it's a very wide beak. This lower mandible is an orange yellow. I mean, this picture here, you can't really see that alone. That may not be the best field mark unless you're looking directly up from the bird. The throat and breast are typically white. This one has a little buff on it, but overall kind of a white throat, a white breast, fairly short wings. So the primaries extend very short, so very tiny wings, short tail. Least flycatcher, its scientific name is Empidonax minimus. So this is going to be a very small bird. But by far, one of the best field marks of it is a conspicuous eye ring. And it has an eye ring at every sex and almost at every age. So it has that eye ring, which is just that white area around that black eye. It's a nice field mark for the least flycatcher. Least flycatchers live in really anywhere where there's forest. So deciduous, mixed forest in the province, you're going to find least flycatchers. These birds cluster together. And so if you find one least, you're going to find a lot more. Vocalization wise, so vocalizations, let's talk about that for just a minute. When we talk about song, that's what male birds do. So typically here in North America and in the Empidonax, only male birds sing for the most part, where call notes are done by either sex and at any age. So song by males for mate attraction or territorial defense, call notes usually for communication with its mate or someone else just kind of in the area. Least flycatchers have one song type. It's a very strong chebec, and they have a single call note that's a note. And so I'm going to play chebec, and hopefully we can hear it. At the end, it's going to do this wit call. Could you hear the recording?
Yes.
Perfect. That was my biggest fear. Maybe it should have been showing the slides, but here we go. Least flycatcher is extremely common in Alberta. Anywhere there's a forest in the summer, typically you'll find a least flycatcher. If you find one, again, you find them all. They occur in all natural areas. And when I talk about natural areas, Alberta's kind of broken down into grassland, aspen parkland, boreal forest, foothills, and mountains themselves. So any habitat in the province, you will find these least flycatchers, by far the most common Empidonax. The dusky flycatcher, another nice Empidonax, is a medium-sized bird with a narrow bill, a medium tail, short primaries, has a fairly dull lower bill or lower mandible. Overall, my impression of dusky flycatchers, it's a very dull bird. It's very drab. There's just not a lot of color on it. I mean, those two wing bars are fairly obvious in that picture there. Its eye ring is not well defined. This one kind of has some sort of an eye ring behind the eye, but not really on the front. And this really varies with this bird overall. But just my take overall when I see a dusky, it's just really a drab kind of medium-sized bird that's fairly elongate. Like it seems really skinny to me when I see them. Where would you find dusky flycatchers? In open deciduous habitat that's typically been disturbed in some way. A lot in the foothills. We find a lot of dusky flycatchers in the foothills. Vocalizations, their song is a 3-syllable song that they can change the order of those syllables, and that's going to become important later on when we try to identify another flycatcher. Their call note is a whit as well. So very similar to the least flycatcher, if we want to think about that. So here is a visual representation of a song called a spectrogram. And these are kind of the mnemonics I have for the syllables: schlip, rink, reet. And again, they can alter the order that they do that. Typically, schlip is first. So let's listen to a sample of that. And you can kind of tell with that song, there's a distinguishing gap between those syllables, like it's singing it fairly slow. Where would you find them in Alberta? Particularly in the foothills along the Forestry Trunk Road, which is Highway 40 or Highway 940, in Waterton National Park. The best place I think to find them close to Calgary is in Kananaskis country at Barrier Lake. If you walk near the dam, you will hear them singing in mid-May and singing fairly strongly, and they breed throughout kind of that area around Barrier Lake. And Cypress Hills has a nice population of dusky flycatchers as well. The locations I kind of talk about here in Alberta are the locations that I've been doing a lot of my research. And so there may be other areas in the province that we find these birds. I'm just telling you the ones where I encounter them quite often. So I'll be happy to add anything to it if you're happy to share later on. A similar one to dusky is Hammond's flycatcher. These are sister species, very closely related to one another. Hammond's flycatcher is a very small bird, short tail, short bill, and you can kind of see in this picture, it's got a big head. It's a very large-headed flycatcher. Large head, but compact body. That's kind of contrasting terms there. It's got a very straight, narrow bill. Half of the bill is dark, and then it kind of turns a yellowy orange. These birds have a very conspicuous eye ring. And overall, if you want to talk about plumage, to me, it's a little grayer typically than olive. Hammond's flycatchers are very active, and they do a lot of tail flicking and wing flicking at the same time. So if you see a bird kind of doing that in this particular habitat we're going to talk about in the next slide, effectively, it's probably Hammond's flycatcher. When we talk about Hammond's, where would we find that? It's in montane coniferous forests. So it's in the mountains, pretty much the foothills in the Rocky Mountain region, in pine trees, spruce trees, and so forth. Vocalizations looks very similar and sounds very similar to dusky flycatchers. The song is 3 syllables like the dusky flycatcher. However, typically in Hammond's flycatcher, the order of the syllables is the same. It does not deviate like we hear in dusky flycatcher. The call note of Hammond's is a pit or a peck note. And to me, Hammond's flycatcher song sounds a lot more harsh then dusky flycatcher. So let's listen to that for a minute. And so very similar. I have a hard time telling these two apart. Where would you find them in Alberta? By far the best place to find them, the most reliable place to find them in the summertime is Muleshoe Picnic Area in Banff. Those birds have been there for the last 10, 20 years. So it's a nice, close location to find that. These birds are pretty much spread out all through the Rocky Mountains, and they're local and they're fairly uncommon. Again, the only place I've ever seen them or heard them really is at Muleshoe Picnic Area. So I mean, that's one we don't see too often. And out of all of them, if you had to kind of guess, this would be the one that I'd say would be least likely to encounter in the province. Alder flycatchers, my favorite flycatcher. It's a chunky bird. I can say that because I worked on it and, you know, did all kinds of stuff with it. So it's a chunky bird. It's got a very wide bill. The lower mandible is very pale. You can see that in this individual here. The primaries, so the wings themselves, are very long compared to the other species we looked at so far. This bird has a very nice white throat. The eye ring is variable. Some of them have a really clear, distinct eye ring around it. As the summer progresses, that eye ring kind of wears somewhat and becomes less and less visible. Some birds, even in the spring, kind of have half an eye ring. So it is a highly variable characteristic. But just kind of overall, this chunky bird, the correct habitat, and the song, along with these features, are going to allow you to identify this as an alder flycatcher. So alder flycatchers like wet thickets. So really wet, flooded beaver pond areas is where you'd find alder flycatchers. That's where I did work on them. Their vocalizations, they have one song type known as phoebio. And here's that song type. To me, it's very abrupt. Their call note is a common pit note. During my research with them, I was doing song playback to them. And in response to playing back alder flycatcher song, these birds did a whole variety of call notes. And so the bottom part here on the left is a spectrogram of a variety of call notes. So the first note here is the zwio, then the double peak, then the weo, then the pit note, which is the most common one, and then a chur note. And let's listen to that. I'll play it twice because it's fairly quick. I'll play it 3 times. That was a bird that was really ticked off because it did that in a sequence. I did not put that together. That was the bird actually singing. Where would you find this in Alberta? This is one of the most common flycatchers we have in the province. Least by far is the most common. I would say alder is probably second. It occurs in every region of the province except for really the grasslands. Very, very rare in the grasslands. Bryant Creek along Highway 68 in Kananaskis country is a great place to see it. My field site, lots of them. When I was working there were at least 24 males singing during the summertime. So it's a nice location to find them, and they're very common. Its sister species, willow flycatcher. These two, the willow and the alder flycatcher, up into 1973 used to be grouped together as trails flycatcher because telling them apart was extremely difficult and people hadn't really done a lot of research with it. So these were split into alder and willow flycatcher in 1973. Willow flycatcher is a very robust bird to me. It's very large, got a wide beak, very big beak on that bird. That beak just looks very heavy. Again, it's a large-headed bird. It's got a very pale mandible, long primaries, white throat, exactly what I just told you effectively for alder flycatcher, right? I didn't use the word chunky for willow, but again, same type of bird. These are two of the hardest ones to tell apart. There is no visible eye ring, though, in a willow flycatcher. It just simply has a dark eye with no white around it, where the alder flycatcher would have the white around the eye itself. Willow flycatchers, like alder flycatchers, occur in moist thickets. And so really flooded beaver pond areas, anywhere there's water with standing vegetation, in particular parts of the province, particularly the southern part of the province, you can find willow flycatcher. its vocalizations, its song, it has 3 different song types, where the alder has a single one. This has 3. And so I'm going to play you all 3. You can see the diagrams there. The first one is the fizz-bew. The second one is a high fizz-bew. And then it goes creet. So let's listen to this. So here's the fizz-bew. Here's high fizz-bew. And here's creet. And when these birds are singing, they will kind of switch through all of those. And some of the behaviors that these birds do are related to the call note or the songs that they're actually doing. And so their call note is a wit note as well. Where to find it in Alberta, kind of right along the foothills, the forestry trunk road, again, Highway 40 or Highway 940. I've encountered these birds the last couple of years all the way up to Elk Creek, which is fairly high north. Those birds are kind of all in those willow habitats right along the trunk road. It has a fairly limited distribution in the province, really hugging the foothills and hugging those really flooded, really wet areas in the province. The closest places really to see these in relation to Calgary, again, Highway 68, Kananaskis country. At Bryant Creek, there's alders and there's willow flycatchers. So that's a nice place to begin to learn and practice identifying these flycatchers. Sybil Flats, kind of 14 kilometers west of Bryant Creek on Highway 68, only has willows. I've never had an alder there, interestingly enough, but there are lots of willows there singing and very visible sitting up on exposed perches singing. So it's a nice place to study those as well. They're also down in Waterton and part of the new Castle River Provincial Park. And I would call these kind of locally common. If you're in the habitat, you can find them. If you're not going to see them. So this is one, again, that's fairly habitat specific. Out of all these birds, these are the 2 that seem to occur here in the province in effectively the same habitat. And so I kind of want to differentiate between these 2 just a little bit. So when we look at habitat, the habitat differs between these 2, but in an odd way. In eastern North America, that has both alders and willows, alders are found in very wet habitat in eastern North America, while willows are found in drier habitat. However, here in Alberta, that situation is reversed, where the alders are typically in much drier habitat, like that top picture here is at Bryant Creek, where you'd find tons of alders. And the willows are in the deeper, wetter type habitat. This is another picture of Bryant Creek at the bottom. This area had at least 3 or 4 male willows on territory just around this area. Why the situation is reversed, we're really not too sure. It could have been, two different invasions into North America once the ice receded during the last ice age. We're really not too sure. But when we look at songs, again, song plays a huge role in identifying these Empidonax. Alder just has that one song type. It's going to sing Phoebeo, 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 Phoebeo all day. Willow flycatchers are going to do those 3 song types, the fizz-bew, the high fizz-bew, and the creet, in some sort of random order kind of throughout the day. So again, if you can identify the habitat you're in and the song and how many song types, you can identify these 2 species relatively easily. Pacific slope and cordilleran flycatcher are by far the kind of the rarest ones in the province, the one we don't know a lot about, unfortunately. This is a very small bird, and so PSFL stands for Pacific slope, COFL stands for cordilleran. These are very small birds. They have a very long tail for their body. They have yellowish feathers, so they're not really that olive green. There's a lot more yellow in the feathers of these birds. They still have that wide beak, that lower mandible. You can actually see it really nicely on both of these pictures, are kind of a yellow-orange, and they have a teardrop shaped eye ring. On both of these birds, you can see that kind of it's coming to a point right behind the eye like a nice teardrop. That's a feature, though, you're going to have to be, the bird's going to have to be close to actually see it. These birds occur in coniferous forests and always associate with some sort of water. Here in Alberta, though, we seem to have a hybrid between Pacific Slope and cordilleran flycatcher, and we're not really sure which one we have. In 2009, some researchers from UBC kind of researched and looked at the DNA of flycatchers kind of across BC going into Alberta. And what they found was the birds here in Kananaskis, they sampled 6 birds and took their DNA. They were kind of a mixture. When you looked at their DNA, they had about 60% Pacific Slope flycatcher DNA, and the rest of it was cordilleran DNA. And so this suggests that these birds are hybridizing here in Kananaskis, but a majority of them are very similar to Pacific Slope. And so more work is needed to find out which one we really have in the province. Their calls are fairly distinctive, and the more and more I hear these birds when I'm out, I think, and I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination on these birds, I feel that we do have Pacific Slope flycatcher here. But again, there are hybridization occurring in Kananaskis. Vocalizations, their songs are very similar. So here's these 2 spectrograms. You notice they have the same mnemonics. The top one is Pacific Slope. The bottom one is cordilleran. Let's play this. Here's Pacific Slope. That pasite note is fairly diagnostic. Now let's listen to cordilleran. Oops, wrong one. So subtle differences in their song. However, these birds, the males do sing a position note where they're sitting on top of an exposed perch, and typically will sing for a few hours on that. Those seem to be distinctive. So here's the position note of Pacific Slope flycatcher. To me, it's just a single note going through, kind of. And here's the position note of cordilleran. That's more like pasite to me. That seems to be the way to tell those apart. But again, they are so similar that I'm always a little on the fence about, what to call these guys. Where would you find them? In Alberta, Kananaskis Highway 68, actually 1 kilometer west of Sybil Meadows Pond. There's kind of a curve in the road, and that curve in the road has a lot of flooded beaver pond area there with a lot of moss and stuff on the hillside. On those logs that are on those trees that are in the water, typically you can find one of these Pacific Slope or cordilleran singing or doing that position note from that location. Bryant Creek, if you go the far south side, you have Jumping Pound Creek there. We have encountered those birds there. The last 6 years, I've encountered them in Cypress at Ghost Airstrip, just simply parking in the parking lot. The Ghost River is right there. You can hear at least 1 or 2 of those birds along the river there by Ghost Airstrip. Banff and Jasper have these as well. Again, this is the one where we had, which one do we have? There's still up to some debate. And again, more work needs to be done. Yellow-bellied flycatcher, large head, short-tailed bird, broad bill. The bill, again, the lower mandible, you can kind of see on this bird is orange yellow. It does have a very distinctive eye ring like least flycatcher, but it does have yellow, kind of a tinge of yellow on the breast and belly of these birds themselves. These birds occur kind of in northern Alberta in extremely wet habitat with lots of muskeg. So wet, mosquito-y habitat. Not a lot of work's been done on yellow-bellied flycatchers. And I think part of it is no one seems to want to work on Empidonax, number 1. And number 2, this habitat is just not conducive to enjoying your work if you're slogging through muskeg all the time. Vocalizations, they have a single song type known as chebunk. It sounds very similar to Chebec of least flycatcher, but we'll play that in just a minute. Its call note is peer-wee. Here's the chebunk. A little harsher than least. Locations for this bird in Alberta, and this is a bird I've only seen, I think, a handful of times in the province. Boreal forest or foothills, anywhere where there's, again, wetlands, muskeg, you'll find that. Been reported at Cypress Hills, but I have a feeling that's a migrant. Grand Cache, Fort McMurray, further north in the province, where you do get the muskeg, you're going to find these birds. Last time I gave this talk, someone told me that West Bragg Creek Provincial Park had 1 or 2 yellow-bellied flycatchers. I have not checked that out yet, but that would be the closest place to Calgary to find this bird. Again, I don't have confirmation whether or not it's there. So in summary, Empidonax flycatchers can be very challenging to identify. However, they can be identified with practice. Going out, early in the spring, finding a location, saying, okay, I'm going to watch this bird, see what it does, see how it behaves, see how it sings, will help you begin to learn how to deal with this confusing group of birds. And of course, it takes a little patience. You can't just look at the bird and say, oh, it's a flycatcher, and just move on. You got to take some time and really learn what the bird's doing, kind of get to know the bird itself. Again, vocalizations themselves, both the song and the call note. Call note, again, is very similar to within some species, but that's by far the best cue to identify these species. When can we see these Empidonax? Dusky and least will start arriving kind of in mid-May. About May 15th is when I found the first Duskies and the first leasts. Later on in late May, early June, when Alder and Willow start to return. And by the first week of June, you should have the whole suite of Empidonax back in the province themselves. So get out early in the morning, enjoy that dawn chorus. You're going to hear all kinds of birds, not just Empidonax, but everything else. It is a fantastic thing to hear. I'm going to wish you good luck at identifying these birds. It's not easy, I can tell you that now, but again, patience pays off. If you want any additional information, any comments, any questions, again, feel free to email me. I'm always happy to talk about flycatchers. I'd be remiss, though, being an educator, if I didn't give you a quiz. There's no grading on this quiz or anything, but we're going to kind of go through what we talked about and see if we can identify what bird we're talking about here. And there are only 4 of them. So here's quiz number 1. Here's our bird, and it's going to tell you because, sorry, I had it showing up before. So looking at this bird, open disturbed habitat, dry upland, mainly poplar, plumage, again, drab overall, just a kind of gray green. Vocalizations, it's got a 3-part song that it can vary which syllables it uses in what order. Its call note is a wit. That would be a dusky flycatcher. We're in a wet flooded beaver area. We've got willows and bog birch. We got a chunky bird that has somewhat of an eye-ring here. Wide bill, white throat, sings one song type. Its call note is a pit. It'd be an alder flycatcher. And so kind of doing the checklist of what habitat am I in? What is the overall appearance of that bird, ignoring effectively plumage? What's the vocalizations it's doing? What is the call note? That's going to allow you to identify these birds. As you are aware, all these flycatchers look alike, but also there are other species that look very similar to these flycatchers. And inevitably, in early May, late May on Alberta Bird or eBird, we get reports of alder flycatchers coming in early May. And it's typically a ruby crowned kinglet because this bird does look like an Empidonax, right? But look at the bill. The bill is a lot thinner. It's not going to be very wide. This is just a much smaller bird. And when you look at ruby crowned kinglets moving, they move nonstop in the trees. There's always movement. It's really hard to get your binoculars on them. And so a lot of the times these are reported as Empidonax. They're just simply not. And we know that just simply because the time they're being reported. And so again, really think about what you're doing. This is a much smaller bird than any of those Empidonax we talked about tonight. Finally, we're in Fish Creek. We're at Glenfield Day Use area, so near St. Mary's. We have a tiny bird, chebecking constantly. It chebecks all day early in the spring. Got a very noticeable eye ring. And occasionally when it's singing, its wings kind of quiver every few minutes with a call note. It kind of spazzes out with its wings and kind of shakes. That's a nice characteristic of a least flycatcher. Again, the most common type of flycatcher we have here in the province. I just want to kind of give you this idea. I've said a lot about Sybil Creek Trail, Highway 68, and I've kind of have this map here. If you get off at exit 143, here's Bryant Creek, Sybil Flats, the Western Flycatcher location, Barrier Lake. If you go here in early June, you can get 5 to 6 species of flycatchers easily along this road. Again, if you stop at the habitat, you listen, again, patience, you'll kind of get that. So thank you very much for listening to my talk. And I apologize for all of the technicalities and issues with Zoom and PowerPoint. Again, I apologize. So thank you very much, though, for coming to my talk. I'll entertain any questions. So Alan is asking, why is Alder your favorite? It's just simply the one I've done the most research on. I spent 2 years in hip waders, in water, recording these flycatchers at 3 o'clock in the morning, doing research on them. So I really like the Alder flycatcher. Whenever I hear it, I kind of perk up, and I always smile when I hear it. So that was a nice question. Any other questions? You're muted, Anne. Thank you, Lori. Thanks, Mark. My 2013 presentation is posted on Nature Calgary's website, so you're welcome to look at that. Robert's asking, are fall alders and willows identifiable? If they're not vocalizing, I would be really wary of trying to identify any of these flycatchers. It's just so tough. And plumage, you know, in the spring, they've just molted. They're nice and pretty. You see contrast between the white and the green, but as it wears on during the summer and the fall, it is really hard. The plumage gets really ratty. And so it is really hard to identify fall alders and willows. And my colleagues in Belize that actually are banding them, they have no idea what flycatchers they get. They just simply say Empidonax and they release them. And so they need help being able to identify these as well. So Donna's asking, what's the appearance clues again for a yellow-bellied flycatcher? Just effectively, it's kind of got a yellow belly, obviously, kind of a big head. It's kind of a chunky bird as well. It's one of those we don't see very often in the province, just because it kind of moves through quickly and just gets as north as fast as possible. So Anne's asking, is the variation in bill size and shape related to different insects that they prey on? Nice question, Anne. All of these birds are just simply hawking or fly catching. So they sit in a stationary location, see an insect, fly up, grab it with that really typically wide beak, and then sit back down. So they're not very picky. There's no, I don't think any research has been looked at, okay, alders are feeding on mosquitoes where willows are feeding on another insect. That'd be really hard to measure, but be interesting because there is variation in the beak. So it could be related to diet.
Sorry. My screen has gone weird. Thank you.
Well,
I can't do anything. My screen has stopped.
We can hear you, Anne, though, and thank you very much for again
I
inviting
didn't
me
know
for
you
this
could hear
talk.
me. Thank you. Well, thank you, Scott, so much for this. I'm sorry, but my screen has just gone wild and I can't see the chat box. I can't type in and I can't do anything. I don't know what's going on.
I totally feel you after what I just went through. So I totally have sympathy for you for that one.
Anyway, thank you so much, Scott. Very interesting. I've got little notes written here. And and thank you everybody for attending. We have one more bird study group for this year. If anybody has ideas for next year, please let me know because I will start trying to book people for next year. So if anybody has an idea, please get in touch with me. And we'll see you in the beginning of May, and then we're done for the summer. So Thank you very much.
Thank you all again. I appreciate it. And thank you for listening to the talk, and have a good luck birding.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.